tonight, sometimes I said not long ago we had a lesson that there are things that you say in preaching, just occasionally they're sprinkled in there, kind of like putting salt on a dish, I guess. And then sometimes I'll take time to have a lesson that just talks about a group of things that you might have mentioned at times, and you do mention at times, and once in a while you say them in preaching on some other subject to kind of make a point. Well, tonight I'm going to include a number of them. Now, I have in my library some books that are, there are various speakers among the brethren over the years that have been involved in an area of study that's called apologetics. And what they're really saying is that they're taking the Bible and defending it and looking at technical arguments that can be made. And sometimes those technical arguments are a little bit too technical for me and probably would be for you. I know I've got one book that I really enjoy reading. It was written by a man by the name of Arnold Schnabel. And he's got a history involved in that. He was converted very late in life, had been an atheist, and was converted basically because of several workmen that worked with him in Seattle, Washington for Boeing. And they kept arguing about scriptural topics, and they finally decided they'd just have a debate at their lunch hour over the fact of whether God existed and whether the Bible was true or not. And he said that during the period of time of debating those men, he actually converted himself, and he became a gospel preacher. And he's written a great deal over the years. I'm not sure if he's still living. He's a good deal older than me if he is. But he wrote several books that were really good books that were showing things that were scientific facts in the Bible. But he was a very technical person, a very educated scientist, and sometimes his arguments were kind of difficult to follow. That's not me. I'm a very simple individual and not a real technical person. So when I say the Bible is not a book of science, but I want to look at some very obvious things that are very obvious, that really don't require any kind of scientific study. They're just things that we know from basically common sense. And yet they're things that in our present age are known and basically are not facts that have always been accepted. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about, I've talked about in passing several times, but I want to mention it again. And that is, if you were to look at any book that deals with the origin of, I would say man, but maybe we should say the origin of life, and the evolutionary process that has developed the various ecosystem, the ecosystem in which we live, it will follow a basic pattern, every one of them. In fact, probably every one of you have seen the charts. You've all seen the charts where you look at a body of water, and underneath the water there's some type of action there that takes place, and a small cell develops, and then that chart will show various developments that take place, and then all of a sudden some animal will crawl out of the water onto the land, kind of an amphibious creature, and then that develops into various stages and eventually becomes a bird, and then that continues, and you see that chart, and it goes along, and it goes through various stages until finally you end up with very highly developed mammals and man. I mean, everybody's seen those charts. I mean, that's a chart that is commonplace in almost every science textbook that you want to look at. What's always interested me, and I've mentioned it several times in preaching, but I'm trying to group everything together tonight, so excuse me for saying the same things over and over. But if you look in Genesis 1 and verse 11, it's interesting to me that God's account of creation in the book of Genesis mirrors that chart. I mean, it really does. If you ask a scientist dealing with the origin of life, what life developed first, he will have almost, if not every time, tell you that it would be a vegetable form of life. Well, what did God say? God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. And the earth brought forth grass. And he's talking about vegetation. an herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good. Now, it's kind of interesting. Then you jump down to verse 20, and I skipped verse 14 through 19 because we're going to come back to that a bit later. But down to verse 20, and he continues this development of life. Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl. That's the next on that chart, that may fly above the earth and the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales and living creatures that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly. And God blessed them and said, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. And then after the fowl and the seas were full of life, then God said, Let the earth bring forth a living creature after his kind, cattle, the more highly developed animals, what we would call mammals, and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after his kind. It was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth from them after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the last thing that God did is the last thing you see in that chart. You see that chart that begins with a little single cell animal life in the ocean and all the developments that take place. And you keep seeing that chart progress up. And finally, you see man. Well, God says that man was the final act of creation. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him, male and female created them. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the order of creation and the order that you see in these these graphs that demonstrate life, and you see it progress there, they're identical. Now, it just seems strange to me that God wrote, when he gave his account of creation, something that mirrors what man now says is the way that life came into being. Now, they don't say it was created. I understand that. They believe it came into existence by some type of accidental electrical impulses on the bottom of the ocean and evolutionary process that led to the present time that we have. I'm not saying that they agree in every respect. I'm just saying it's interesting that the order is exactly the same. There are no real differences in the order. That order that you see in your science textbook and that order you see in Genesis 1 would be the same. Now, that is not characteristic of all of the mythological writings of man. That's just not true. When you look at the mythological writings of man, they're not consistent with known scientific fact. But when you look at what God said, it just has always interested me. When you look at that chart and you look at the account of creation, they mirror each other. So God was accurate in the order in which life came into existence. God also said this, and this is something we know to be true. Plants and animals can only reproduce within their own kind. Now, I'm not a biologist, obviously. I'm not a person who studies the reproduction of plants or animals, and I don't know all there is to know. But this much I do know. You can do a certain amount of cross-pollination, and you can see a certain amount of interbreeding, but there are limits to what you can do. And what I mean by that is that we don't see half cats and half dogs. That we don't see that. We don't see half people and half monkeys. We don't see that. We don't see corn that's half wheat. We don't see that. There are things, now there are some things that can be done, but as far as, especially in nature, you just don't see it at all. What you see is what the Bible says to be true. The earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, the tree yielding fruit after whose kind was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good. Now, most all of you have seen, I used to have a good friend, Dugan Kincaid, lived beside him for several years, and he was a person that knew about as much about orchards and plants as anybody I've ever met. And he had one tree, and I don't remember what all he had growing on that thing. I don't even remember. I mean, he had one that had apples, and I don't even remember what all was on it. And people look at it and think, well, that disproves what God has said. No, that doesn't at all. If you talk with him about what he did, he could graft those things in, but he couldn't cause those pears and those apples to sometime be produced on the same tree. He would have them grafted in. It's kind of amazing to see it, but it didn't disprove this, because every time those tree limbs that had pears on them produced fruit, it was always pears. and those limbs on the same tree that had apples, they were always apples, even though he had pretty well crossed it up by that grafting process in some instances. You still would have God's Word borne out, that each one of those things would bring forth after his kind, and it didn't make any mistakes. In the 21st verse of the same chapter, he said the same thing about the fowl and the sea creatures. Now, there are limits to how far they can go. In fact, sometimes man has brilliant ideas and reproduces hybrid animals of certain kinds, and then you have a little bit of a problem. You don't have those occur in nature. They occur because of man's selective breeding processes, but they can't reproduce. Just like certain carp that you have in ponds that keep your pond clean. They don't reproduce. Mules don't reproduce. David's had experience with that. You can produce them with the horse and the donkey, but you don't keep having mules. You have to go back to the horse and the donkey if you want to accomplish that. You know, man may monkey with it a little bit, but the fact is that what God said will be true. And when you look down to verse 21, and he talks about these various creatures, the truth is they produce after their kind within very strict boundaries. And when you look at animals, the beasts of the field, they do the same. And when you look at man, man does the same. I mean, you may see some differences that occur over a period of time, but when all's said and done, a cow's still a cow, and a pig's still a pig, and a man's still a man. And we need to realize that. We need to understand it. And that's what God said in the beginning. And everybody today recognizes that to be true. That's one thing I can't really figure out about when people start talking about evolution. Evolutionists will tell you that's not happening now. There are no links where there's transitional phases, and that's not apparent. It's not there. And yet they expect us to believe by faith that at some point in time it did occur. So you have to realize that what God said comports with all the facts that we have before us. Now, not the speculative theories of man, but comports with all the facts that we have before us. And there's no doubt about that. Also, another interesting thing to me, and I gained this information from Joe Corley several years ago. In Genesis 7, when it talks about the flood, said the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and buried the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth, and the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the heaven, whole heaven were covered, 15 cubits upward, and the waters prevailed, and the mountains were covered, and the mountains were covered. A lot of folks may or may not know that Joe Corley is what some people would call a rock hound. He has some beautiful pieces that he's made. A lot of them made out of fossils that he had recovered from the mountains of Canada. He would go up there and find fossils. Now, those fossils were actually sea creatures. They were fossils of sea creatures. And he would bring them home and slice them in half and make these beautiful things. And that's kind of an industry, by the way. You sometimes see them at various craft shops, etc., and so forth and so on. Places like Gatlinburg, you'll see some of them at times. You can go into some rock museum there, or rock store. And it's just interesting to me that those sea creatures that he's cutting up came from the tops of mountains. Well, what God said would seem to be born to be true. And the fact of the matter is that there has been water there. There has been oceans there. And that the place that these were gathered were hundreds of miles inland on very high mountains. Not the highest in the world, but very high mountains in the 7,000 to 8,000 feet range. So you're talking about things that indicate that what God said was true. Another thing that's interesting to me is this. You know, we argue all the time. In fact, with our current civil rights movement that's been in the process of carrying on really since the Civil War, there's been this argument that all the races of men are from one source, and they are. We all have a common origin. Now, you know, we see people who are very prejudiced against people of other races, and that happens. But, you know, it's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black, because we're all related. Every one of us. Every living human being is related to every other living human being. Now, Jim the other night in his class said something about that, and he said he didn't know if it was through Adam or through Noah, and I raised my hand and said it had to be through Noah, because the fact of the matter is that Noah and his 3 sons and their wives and his wife was all that was left after the flood. But if you go back to Genesis 10, which is when Noah comes forth in the ark, and we find there in verse 32, when he completes the genealogy of the 3 sons of Noah, and says, these are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. Telling you, without question, that man is related to each other. Now, you may say, well, everybody knows that. But you have to understand something. That wasn't a commonly accepted fact until recently modern history. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go along. Another thing that interests me is that when you think of blood, the Bible talks about blood, and Leviticus 17:11 is one of the places that is almost the most interesting statement that's made because of the clarity of it, and this, I guess the word is pronounced specificity. I can't hardly pronounce it, but in words, it specifically defines certain things. For the life of the flesh is in the blood. Now, that's a statement that's made that is true. I mean, so true that when you think about it in today's world, you know and I know. I mean, even if we don't have a degree in science, every one of us knows that when you look at blood, blood is very different. Sometimes it's interesting to see people that look at blood on TV when there's a shooting or a killing, and they look at it and what they're expecting to see something that's bright red. And it may not be. And the reason it's not is because what makes it bright red is when it's carrying the oxygen to the cells. But when it's coming back, after it's dumped the oxygen and it has the carbon dioxide, then it turns a lot darker. And it's not nearly as bright. But that kind of illustrates the point. Your blood is the thing in your body that sustains everything in it. Everything in it has the blood to carry the nutrients to it, the oxygen to it, and carries the waste products off from it. And it's a constant process. You know, if you think about how wise man is, in our cities we have all these systems that we distribute gasoline, and we distribute natural gas and electricity, and then we have these large places we collect sewage, and we treat it and make it back into clean water. Your body does that all the time to a much more intricate degree than man has ever been able to develop. And that's really what he's talking about. And you know, you say, well, Moses didn't know that. I know Moses didn't know that. But I'll tell you what he did know. He did know that this was that God had inspired him to make that statement, and he said that statement because God wanted to say, it's the blood that maketh atonement for the soul, because, and he based that on the fact that the blood is the life of the flesh. And it's something that everybody really understands that. So it's not one of those facts that's difficult and intricate and hard to prove. One of the things, and it goes back to what we said earlier about all the races of men being interchangeable, being related to each other, is that blood is interchangeable. I've watched some programs and read some books when blood transfusions were first attempted, and they first were attempted much different than today. Today, of course, we take the blood, we go through a lot of processes, and then it goes back into our bodies after a lot of tests and such things. Originally, that wasn't the way it was done. They just simply got 2 people that would lay down on cots beside each other and stick a tube in one arm and a tube in the other arm and transport the blood directly from one person's body to another. And when that was originally done, people were really concerned about race, particularly about black men and black women. We didn't want any blood from them because that was a problem. They were viewed as inferior, and they really weren't people. They were kind of half people, and so you couldn't do that. My understanding is that the Red Cross, as far as I know, makes no distinction on their blood saying what race it came from. They don't care. What they do care is its type, etc., and all that. But as far as the race of person, they don't care. And it's interesting that God had said, and you know, to me, if people would just pay attention to what God said when He wrote it, it would help us not to make a lot of the mistakes that we made. when people went around arguing, oh, you can't do that because, that blood's not going to work because it doesn't come from a white man or it doesn't come from a black man. Well, that's not true. God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth. Now, I know that some races of people have certain characteristics, others don't. As far as I'm aware, I've heard this statement many times, I suppose it to be true, that sickle cell anemia is something that is not characteristic of white people. It is kind of a disease that's specific blood disease of those who are black. And I understand that. And there are some characteristics of that type. But it still doesn't change the fact that the blood is still the same. There's no difference in it. And it's something that God had said many, many centuries before that people simply ignored. I know I've mentioned this over and over and over again, but I wanted to try to do it in a setting where I could put all these things together and also give me maybe a little more time to talk about it. This passage in Psalms 139 to me is fascinating. Every time I read it, I get more and more fascinated by it because it makes a statement that is so different than what people had always assumed in the past. If you were to think about the times in the days of superstition, when someone was expecting a child, a baby was about to be born, they had all these things that they said you don't do and you don't get around because it's going to change the baby. Well, we all know that's not true. Now, then that was pretty common accepted ideas. But if you look at the 139th Psalm, verse 16, David is talking about what God knows about us. And he is talking specifically about a time when he was not yet developed. He was conceived, but he wasn't yet developed. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. Now, he didn't mean unperfect in the sense it might make a mistake. That's not what he meant. What he meant wasn't perfectly developed. A child from the point of conception, and that's what's really interesting. I've been looking at that a lot here lately, and it just impresses me about this verse. From the point of conception, many things are dictated that simply cannot be altered. He said, and yet being unperfect, in thy book all my members were written. I would suppose that once we really master the art of understanding the DNA, once we really, and I know that's a relatively new field of study, relatively new, and I'm not dumb. I know that over a period of time we're going to learn more and more and more about that. I suspect there's going to come a point in time when scientists can pretty well look at the DNA of a one cell that's been conceived and could probably tell you just about everything about it physically. What color his eyes is going to be, what color his hair is going to be, what his general bone structure is. I got a feeling they're going to be able to tell you a whole lot of things. And that's what David was saying. He said, in thy book all my members were written, which in countenance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. I didn't yet have any hair, but I knew what color it's going to be. Didn't have any eyes, but knew what color they're going to be. Didn't have any bones yet, but I kind of knew what my general bone structure was going to be. Not that I knew, but God knew. And that's what he's talking about. Nowadays, we look at things that we discover, and we marvel at them. And even though the Bible's not a book of science, it's just astounding that the things that it once said that were not accepted. You do realize that people used to think that all those characteristics were developed after conception because of the circumstances and environment that you were placed in, which has nothing to do with it. If we just paid attention to God, we would have known in the beginning. But as they say, hindsight is always 20/20. One of the most commonly taught things that you see more than any other is Isaiah 40 in verse 22. Isaiah 40 is one of the passages that you've probably heard people read many, many times because of the wording. It is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth. And the word circle in the original language is defined as a sphere or spherical in shape. Now, there is a difference between a circle in the sense that when we used to play marbles, we'd draw a circle on the ground. Now, that's flat. That's not three-dimensional. But a circle in the sense of something that's three-dimensional is like a ball. is circular every direction that you turn it. Now, in our day, we know for an absolute fact that the earth is a sphere. How do we know that? Because we have pictures from outer space. So we know for an absolute fact. We've got actual pictures from outer space that show us the earth and the shape of it. What sometimes people don't realize, they think, oh, that's common information. That's not so great. But understand this. If you go back to, 1600s and almost into the 1700s, that was a rejected idea. The Catholic Church actually executed people because they taught the earth was spherical. They believed the earth was flat. And they had them executed, consider them heretics, because they would ever argue such a foolish notion. And now everybody knows that. But it's interesting that Isaiah spake of that back in about 600 years before Christ was born, so that'd be about 2,800 years ago. He said the earth is a circle. Man has discovered that and knows that and takes that for granted for less than 400 years. 2,800 years ago, God said it. Man finally catches up. It's just kind of interesting to me. One of the things that I mentioned many times, and I'm not going to go into all the details of this, of how this came to light again. I've done it in Bible classes, and I'm not going to do it again. But here are the facts. The Bible makes this statement: the fowl of the air and the fish of the sea, and whatsoever passeth through the paths of the sea. Now that word paths is a word that specifically is definitively describing what we would know as a path. I mean, you have a walking path here in town. It's a path. It's defined. Of course, it's concrete, but it doesn't have to be concrete. But the fact that it is a path, and everybody, it can be defined as exactly what it is. Well, that's exactly what he's talking about. And I look at that, and I'm not a person that knows anything about the ocean. So the only reason I know anything about this is because I've read it. But that's an absolute fact. You ever look at shipping lanes? You'll look at shipping lanes sometime, and you'll understand this principle very, very quickly. From what I can see and understand, if you were to take an ocean vessel and send it to Europe, you would go up to the north, up very far north in the northern Atlantic. And then if you get ready to come back, you don't go that way. You come back very far south through that's the only one that I really remember that's called the Gulf Stream. And it comes in and flows from Europe and comes into the United States. And you know the reason they do that? Because it saves so much fuel. I mean, if you get in a river, which is the easiest way to go? Well, the easiest way to go is go with the current. And that's what we do. Currents are coming from England to the south, and they're going to England to the north. And that's really what he's talking about. And actually, the reason they were discovered was because sea captain actually read those words or had them read to him and said, you know what, God said that must be so. Went out and tried to find them and did. So you see that God would make these statements, and to me it's just interesting. And I'm picking ones that are not complicated, that are common, that even a common person like myself can understand. But I want to go back to Genesis 1 and talk about something that is not complicated, something everybody here understands, I would think. In Genesis 1, when God talked about the lights, He said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day and the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And God made two great lights. The greater light to rule the day, we call that the sun. And the lesser light to rule the night, He made the stars also. You know, we sometimes talk about a moonlit night, but you realize that there is no such thing as a moonlit night? No, there's not. The light that you get from the moon doesn't emanate from the moon. Moon doesn't have any light. The moon's a mirror, what it really is. And the moon mirrors the light of the sun. So when you have what you call a moonlit night, it's really a sunlit night. It's just indirect lighting created because there's a big mirror reflecting it back to you. And it's interesting that the words that are used in the original language, the lesser light to rule the night, that's exactly what it means. It's not talking about it's a smaller light. It's talking about it as a light that is dependent upon another source for its light. That's what it's talking about. And that's what the moon is. Now, if you look at what he said there, and he says that these divide the day and the night, which we all know that to be true. The sun comes out, it's daytime, goes down, it's nighttime. The moon comes out sometimes doesn't, depending on the circumstances. And you can really see that the moon is a mirror by looking at the shape of it through the month as it changes places and the earth begins to shadow certain parts of it. And he said, let them be for signs, for seasons, for days and years. And think about it. Have you ever thought about what he didn't mention in there? He didn't mention weeks. Weeks is something that we've developed and God actually gave to us for a purpose. But when he talks about the signs and the seasons, really, our sun dictates our years. And, you know, we've really had a hard time with it over the centuries because we don't understand it perfectly. Our calendar has 365 days divided into 12 months, and they have different amounts of days in it. The Jewish calendar had 13 months with 28 days. And it wasn't completely accurate, but the reason they did that is because the moon has a 28-day cycle, and they would just think when there's 4 cycles completed, that was a month. And that was the whole idea, that it went from new moon to new moon, and that's a month. And then the years, they certainly then had a problem with, because here's the problem. Because of just do the math and you'll see the problem. The problem is it would change the length of years. So we came up with the 365, but even that's not perfect. So once in a while, you hear them talk about the atomic clock out in Colorado, and they have to set that thing. It's perfect, right on the money. Your clock's not, my clock's not. No matter how good it is, it's not completely accurate because of something that I don't understand from a scientific perspective. But the one thing I do know, the sun dictates the years by the distance. And you can see that pretty easily. If you think this is something complicated and hard to understand, let me tell you something. All summer long, I sit in my recliner in the morning and drink my coffee and have the window open on the eastern side. It doesn't bother me a bit. When winter comes, I can't do that. Every morning I have to get up and go pull the shade down because I just cannot sit there because the sun changes position. And that's really what he's talking about. Everybody knows that. And everybody understands the principle of the moon being really a mirror. But God told you that when Moses wrote the book of Genesis. How long has man known that? I don't really know, but a great deal less time than that. Jeremiah said something that's really interesting. You know, he talked about the stars not being numbered. Now, this is one of those cases where we naturally assume something. So, because we assume it to be so, we believe it to be so. When I began to kind of think of this lesson, I was looking for this language as it related to Abraham, the innumerable, that his descendants would be innumerable. What I discovered was it's not there. It doesn't say it specifically in the book of Genesis, but Jeremiah does state it. In Jeremiah 33, in verse 22, he says, as the host of heaven cannot be numbered. Now, I'm going to tell you 2 things here. One is that before Galileo invented the telescope, man believed that this was a passage that indicated that the Bible was not accurate. Because, believe it or not, if you go out in a night sky, I'm told, I've never tried it, but I assume it to be true, if you've got the patience to do it, and you've got the ability to concentrate in a certain area enough to do it, you can count 3,000 stars. Now, that's not innumerable. And so, scientists before Galileo said the Bible is false because it said the stars can't be numbered, and you can easily count them. There's 3,000 of them. But unfortunately, when Galileo invented the telescope, he suddenly saw that what we thought was a star was sometimes thousands of stars. Now, that's not all. Now, we've sent these telescopes into space, and here's the problem we have. As far as we send them, you know what's there? More stars. Every time we get a telescope that could go further, we see more stars. You begin to understand what God is saying. The stars can't be numbered. I mean, if you listen to a program on space exploration and you listen to the scientists speaking, they're going to tell you that. We have no concept, no idea, no way to even begin to dream of how many stars there are. Well, that's what God said through Jeremiah. About 2,800 years ago, the host of the heaven cannot be numbered. And the more we learn, the more that fact is established. Will we ever reach a point that we can send a spacecraft far enough that we can see the edge of the universe? I don't hazard a guess. I would say probably not. That gets into an argument made from Genesis 1 that's a little bit more complicated about the meaning of the word firmament, which means an expanse. And scientists teach us the universe is continually expanding. So I don't know. That's a little bit further. I'm trying to stick with things that are very simple, very easy, that I can comprehend and that you can comprehend. Now, I don't know if that accomplishes a lot of purpose, but I kind of thought about the prayer that Steve uttered tonight, about the lesson that he hoped that he was praying to God that our lesson would help us by building our confidence, basically, in Him. And that's really all I'm trying to accomplish. I guess in part I have to make an apology for it. In part it's just because it's something that I'm interested in. You ever notice people talk about what they're interested in? Sometimes it doesn't mean much. It's just what they're interested in, whether it's baseball, football, sewing, knitting, or whatever it is. That's something that really interests me. Now, that's just a small sampling. But I tried to pick the ones that are the most simple, that basically, everybody already knows. These are not scientific facts that are really way out there and hard to establish. These are things we all know to be true. And look at when God revealed them. Now, here's the problem. We assume, because these are such simple facts, that man has always known them to be true. That's not so. That's not so. Most of these facts have been controversial in the centuries that have gone before and have only recently begun to be accepted as factual information. If you want to stop and think about it, just think about Greek mythology and look at all those horses that have human bodies coming out the top of them. And you understand, they didn't really realize this idea that you produce after your kind. They didn't understand that. You and I do. And one of the reasons we do is because God said so. But anyway, we're going to sing a song of encouragement. Not been a first principle sermon, but it has been a sermon that's trying to encourage you to have confidence in the Bible so that whatever God says, accept it. You know, if all these things that man has in the past argued against, even to the amount of saying that the stars are not innumerable, and they're true, then I can tell you whatever God said about the plan of salvation is true. Think about it as together we stand as we sing.